What is the truth in the stories we are told? We've been given a story of a world fueled by separation. We've become separate from one another, separate from the earth, ultimately separate from the true nature of ourselves. It's time we learn the truth. It's time you rewrite your story. It's time to realign with who it is that you really are. This is the fifth dimension.
You are infinite and eternal. We are infinite and eternal.
Our natural essence, we could say, is simply being.
We have this awakening coming together as a perfect storm.
We're ready for this. We have the capacity inside. We just got to find that.
All right, and we're on the air. Everybody, welcome into the Fifth Dimension podcast. And for today's show, I am joined by independent journalist Jeremy Hammond. Jeremy, thanks for taking the time to come on the show.
You bet.
So I love the work that you're doing. And, you know, when you go to your website, it says right off the bat, exposing dangerous state propaganda. Now, there are, when we hear the word journalist, I feel like it's getting a bad rap nowadays because, you know, when we think of journalists, we think of like the CNNs and the Fox News and all sort of the mainstream journalists who sort of occupy the airwaves. So the work that you're doing is refreshing. And, you know, I can vouch for the validity. I can vouch for the truth that you bring out. I mean, I would love to sort of hear about just, you know, to start how this sort of became your line of work. Was there a story or a moment where you realized that this sort of needed to be the line that you took in terms of exposing things like propaganda?
Yeah, I kind of fell into it accidentally. I mean, I didn't go to school for journalism. I did go to school for communications. I'm actually a film and video major. So that's the only connection between my educational background and the work that I'm doing now. But yeah, it was 9/11. Actually, I had just before 9/11, I had bought a plane ticket, traveled with a friend to Taiwan, where I intended to stay for, you know, half a year. Just teaching English for a while until, you know, I could figure out what I wanted to do, because I kind of, after I graduated with that degree, I just realized it wasn't the right path for me. So I didn't know what I wanted to do, and so I bought my plane ticket, and then the events happened, and so I kind of arrived in Taiwan shortly after that, and you know, I consider myself to be more well educated and more well aware of what was going on in the world than most people, but I was still naive enough at that point to ask myself, you know, why would people do this? And so I just started, you know, I went to the internet cafe there before, you know, I was still staying at a hostel for my initial visit there until I got an apartment and bought my own computer. I was just going to internet cafes and just kind of discovering the internet and just researching things on my own for really the first time ever. You know, in that way for the first time ever. And, you know, and just started writing about it, sending information home. And then before the Iraq War, I was sending information home to friends and family saying, look, the government is lying. There's no evidence that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, and they're demonstrably lying about it. And of course, in hindsight, we know that, you know, we know that now, but, you know, I was saying that beforehand. And so that's kind of what started it. And eventually someone said, why don't you just start a website? So I did, although I began anonymously, because I've always been kind of a shy private person, and this wasn't really something that I wanted to do, but it was just like I couldn't have this knowledge in my head and not share it, because it was just this moral compulsion to get this information out to other people, and just to share what I was learning. And that just kind of led me down this path. And eventually I launched Foreign Policy Journal in 2008. And just it kind of shifted my focus, though, from foreign policy in more recent years to I became a father in 2012. And so I really started researching the vaccine issue very deeply, just diving in, kind of bypassing the middleman and going straight to the medical literature and researching the scientific literature to be able to make an informed choice. You know, parenting choices about that. And so the same thing happened with that. So now it's like, well, I can't have this knowledge and not share it. Like what I learned and about how, you know, what we're told science says and what science actually says, and how they're two completely different things. I couldn't have that knowledge and not share it with other people, even though I knew it was going to be placing a huge target on my back.
Right.
All the attacks out that it would invite, for being a quote unquote anti-vaxxer. I'm not anti-vaccine. I have no problem per se with vaccines. I consider that they're a product. They serve a function. People can choose whether to use them or not, like any other product that's on the market. My problem is with public vaccine policy. And of course, once the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and then we've had these authoritarian lockdown measures with the mass vaccination endgame. So my focus has been 100% on the vaccine and COVID-19 issues. And I haven't had, as much as I'm passionate about foreign policy, I made a decision to stop publishing Foreign Policy Journal so I could focus 100% on this kind of more urgent, closer to home concern.
Right. No, definitely. And I agree with you. And I've sort of had that revelation in terms of the vaccines in this past year, because I started questioning at first, when COVID hit, they already started talking about the vaccines. And I'm like, I don't know, that sounds a little, because I never get the flu shot. I've always been a little weary. But I was vaccinated as a kid, so it's not like I've never had vaccines, but, now it's led me down the rabbit hole of like, oh my gosh, this is all like a lie. It's like science is not what they say it is in the mainstream.
Right. And I had to go to Taiwan. I had to get the hepatitis B vaccine. I didn't think anything about it. I mean, had I known then what I know now, I probably would have tried to find some way to, get out of that. And then also while I was there, I had a tetanus shot. Right. Just kind of thinking if I knew what I knew now, I would say, no, I don't need that. Thank you. And it would have declined. But, I just didn't know at the time. I had no idea.
Right, exactly. And I feel like that's where most people are. And there's like, if you ask somebody who is like, for example, like I speak up about the vaccine as well. And like the people I know who are, I consider friends, they'll completely shun me out of their life essentially. Yeah. But if I ask sort of what their rationale behind, okay, why do you support the vaccine, or what are your thoughts on it? There isn't really any scientific points that they're making. It's all sort of just regurgitated rhetoric. I mean, could you speak on that and like what maybe the narrative is on, I guess vaccines in general and COVID vaccine, but what is sort of the actual truth that exists within that?
Yeah, well, the narrative is dogma. The dogma is vaccines are safe and effective.
Yeah.
That is not a scientific statement. That is a statement of dogma. It is a statement of faith.
Yeah.
And we have this faith-based system in the country where you can't question that. You can't question it's as though the CDC were infallible in its recommendations, specifically with its routine childhood vaccine schedule.
Yeah.
If you dare to even question the wisdom of the schedule and this one-size-fits-all approach, which is completely unscientific. I mean, science doesn't tell us that this is the way to go. Science doesn't say. What science tells us is that every vaccine has its own profile of safety and effectiveness. They're all different. They're not all equally safe. They're not all equally effective. And every single individual has a different risk of the disease that the vaccine is intended to protect against. And every single individual is at different risk of harm from the vaccine. So this idea that we can just have this one size fits all approach is completely 100% unscientific.
Yeah.
It can't be a one size fits all approach. It has to be an individualized approach. And so the establishment is practicing medicine, decades behind the science, a century behind the science. Yeah. Really, because even the whole foundational theories, the whole paradigm of vaccination, but if you think about it, there's kind of like this fundamental assumption that, I don't want to offend anyone, whether they're religious or not, but, so I'll say whether you believe in God or you believe in evolution, either way, there's like this fundamental assumption that we were created without a properly functioning immune system, such that we all require pharmaceutical intervention starting on the first day of our lives with the hepatitis B vaccine in newborns in order to maintain good health. This is ludicrous. And it's also this idea, like there's these things called viruses and bacteria, these germs out there, and they're the enemy, and we have to protect ourselves. We have to eradicate them from the earth.
Yeah.
Like this view, this paradigm of medical science is so outdated and so archaic, and it's time to move into the 21st century. I mean, it's time to move. It's time to have civilized. It's time for humans to become civilized, really, and move past all that archaic nonsense. We're beginning to understand, we just really are beginning to explain this whole new frontiers. And it's just really in the last few decades that we learned about the microbiome, for example, and the importance that how we depend on bacteria for our survival. And same thing with viruses. We're learning how, a surprising proportion of our own human DNA is viral in origin,
right? Because
viruses are essentially like these messengers that help kind of upgrade our software, if you will, to be to adapt with survival benefits. And we require antigenic challenges. Our immune systems require this in order to develop a functioning immunity. And this is why, there's opportunity costs of vaccination. For example, a really good example is measles, and how childhood infections, including measles, have been associated with numerous health benefits. Such as reduced, risk of cardiovascular disease, reduced risk of Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I mean, so science tells us that, especially in early childhood, when the immune system is still in development, it is essential for these antigenic challenges for children to be exposed to bacteria, to viruses, so that they can build their immunity.
Right.
And that will lead to good health, and it will lead to them not having allergies and asthma and autoimmune diseases and all these things that are just all these chronic illnesses. I mean, we look at the medical establishment; they have utterly, totally failed. The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, has totally, utterly failed in its core mission, because we have a sick population.
Right.
I mean, all these chronic diseases in childhood. Back in 2011, there was a study showing 43% of children, this was an estimate, 43% of children had one or more chronic illnesses, and that wasn't even considering obesity. When you add obesity to that, it went up in risk of neurodevelopmental delays. It went up to over 50%.
Right.
So, it's not working. What they're doing is not working. And the idea that vaccines have nothing to do with this, the idea that a product specifically designed to permanently alter the functioning of your immune system has nothing to do with it. This is insane. I mean, let's get real here and have a serious discussion and look at what the science really says, as opposed to, just accepting dogma, which is what it is.
Right, definitely. And they've almost sort of created this war on particularly COVID nowadays. It's like the virus is an invisible enemy, and like we need to fear it and live in this perpetual state of misery with lockdowns and basically cutting off all of the essentials that we need to be a healthy, thriving population. They're kind of taking that away, and they're trying to almost double down on this paradigm of vaccination, and we got to wear a mask, and we cannot touch each other. And I see this, and it almost feels like, I'm in the same boat as you. It almost feels like common sense that these things aren't working. And so I look at all right, what does it sort of just take having the conversations, giving people the actual exposure to what is real to actually wake up to this? Because, I'll even give people this information and they won't want to believe it. Like it challenges their whole foundation of what they, I guess everything they think is true. I mean,
Precisely.
Do you find challenges in that? What sort of way to get people to actually wake up to this and realize this?
Yeah, that actually brings me back again to kind of how I got started. I mentioned I was writing emails home to family and friends and things, and and the denials I was sending good information. I wasn't going to conspiracytheory.com or something. I was going to the UN. Because the UN was, the inspectors. I was looking at their inspection reports throughout the 90s and things, and I was just scouring that kind of information to come to my conclusion that the government was lying, and it was met with this psychological barrier. People just didn't even want to know. In fact, I had people telling me I don't care, I don't want to know this information.
Mm.
And I was just shocked. Like it just stunned me, and I couldn't understand it. And I really struggled with that for a long time, until I realized it's precisely what you just described. It's, people have this belief system, like they believe that the government is good, and that maybe the government makes mistakes, but they only ever have benevolent intent. And that there's this kind of, this ideal of American exceptionalism in foreign policy. And it's the same with domestic policies. In people really have almost a religious faith in government. And so Noam Chomsky has called it the state religion, and that's a term that I've adopted and I use in my own writings quite frequently, because it really is that. And so the vaccine religion is a subsect of the state religion, and it's exactly what you described, that they have people who are brought up where we were indoctrinated with these beliefs since early childhood.
Yeah.
In the school system and in just in society in general, we're indoctrinated with these beliefs. And when people have their fundamental core beliefs challenged, there's confirmation bias. People don't want to accept anything that contradicts their beliefs, whereas they latch on to anything, no matter how incredible,
Yeah.
how lacking in credibility, if it supports their pre-existing beliefs. And so this is a real challenge. It is very difficult to overcome. But I think one strategy is just to try to first establish common ground. It's like, what does everyone agree with, And I think that's a kind of a good first step.
Right. No, and especially, when we're coming from this approach, our goal is still to have a healthy, thriving population, which is what most other people want as well. I mean, that's
Right.
why they wear the mask. It's why they want to take the vaccine, because they've been taught to believe that's what's going to be the savior, if you will. We've very much sort of externalized our whole reality, like as a population, to think that things like vaccines and people like Fauci are like saviors, and they're here and Bill Gates, oh my goodness, you could get into him, but that these people are working for the betterment of us, when in reality there's sort of just the money line involved for them. And it's not, if we look at, I love the point you brought up, if we look at how we're doing as a population, we have never been more sick, we have never seen more disease, we have never been more afraid. And the whole I'd say country is affected by this. Like, it's not just in terms of our disease. Like, we see more people are in poverty now, and that could be because of lockdowns, of course, and there's more homelessness. So it's really just stacking up, and I feel like eventually this is going to collapse on its head, if you will. It almost feels inevitable. I mean, what are your thoughts looking to the future, especially with like the COVID vaccine? Because I agree. I think there's from the beginning, whatever the motivation was, I get the feeling that the mandatory vaccination has sort of been the end game. And I mean, there's speculation on why that is and how that is. And, I have very much a conspiracy theory mind at times, so it can easily dive down those rabbit holes. But I mean, what are your thoughts moving forward on that, and how this system is going to continue to evolve and potentially collapse on itself?
Yeah, to make one more point about the sickness of our society today, the poor health. There's been a shift from infectious disease to chronic illnesses like autoimmune diseases and these types of things. But it's not as though we can attribute the decline in infectious disease morbidity and mortality to vaccinations, because in fact, and this is acknowledged, is completely uncontroversial. In fact, I'm getting this straight from the journal Pediatrics, that 90%, which is the AAP's journal, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and 90% of the decline in infectious disease mortality occurred before vaccines were around to help explain it.
Right.
This is
I remember reading that about
what
polio.
the data show. This is just that's what the data tell us.
Yeah.
So, and we're supposed to believe that, the infectious decline in infectious diseases was because of vaccines, when in fact that's not true at all. In fact, with numerous vaccines, that you can't even observe an impact in the decline. I did this with pertussis. I went through and I got all the data from a CDC document, and I plugged it into Excel, and I graphed the decline in mortality with pertussis, and I calculated that, I found the date when it was became into mass use, and I have this article on my website, and you can't tell like if you had to guess when the vaccine was introduced, you'd never be able to guess it because the decline was already there. And so that's just one example. So anyways, coming back to, the lockdowns. Yeah, it's, as you mentioned earlier, there's no consideration of the cost. In fact, Fauci has acknowledged this, that, that's not his job. His job isn't to do an economic analysis. So he's advocating policies without having done a cost benefit analysis.
Right.
Same thing with, like we had the, in March, there was the Imperial College model that really kicked everything into high gear with the lockdowns. That was the impetus for the UK to lock down. It also was cited as justification for the lockdowns in the US and elsewhere. I mean, they said right in there that they weren't considering the costs of the policy that they were advocating. And this just blows my mind that you can advocate in such an extreme policy as, like stay-at-home orders, like mandatory stay-at-home orders, mandatory business closures, all these types of policies that were implemented without considering the costs. And then, and then they try to excuse it as though, like, oh, well, lives are more important than dollars. As though there was no connection between the economy and people's health and lives. I mean, it just blows my mind that they're getting away with this kind of, this kind of behavior, and that we're supposed to trust these kinds of people with this kind of thinking to like lead the world and to be our leaders and to tell us what to do. I mean, like, really, it's shocking. It's shockingly frightening that they are so myopic. They're so blind. And it's not about health with them. It's just about obedience.
Right.
It's all about, we're the ones in power and we're going to tell you what to do and you will listen.
Yeah.
It's arrogance. And as far as the vaccine endgame, that there's nothing conspiratorial about that at all. Again, read the Imperial College report. They said right in there that this is interesting because at the time the media was reporting one aspect of that and they were omitting an entire other aspect. What they were reporting is that, oh, these models show that, if we just lock down for a few weeks, we can flatten the curve and give hospitals time to ramp up capacity and get PPE and all this. And then, it's just temporary, just for a few weeks. That's how it was sold to the public initially. And they changed, if you recall, they shifted the justification to, oh, well, now we have to stay in lockdown indefinitely until there's a vaccine.
Right.
The thing is if you read a report originally, that's what they were saying originally from the start. They said right in there, like, well, we understand that we can't, that it's just not going to be sustainable to just maintain permanent lockdown. So they advocated this policy of like shutting down, opening up, it's shutting down until cases fell to a certain point, and then if they started to rise again past some, point, then they would have to shut everything down. And it was like treating the economy like a light switch, like you can just shut it on and off.
Right.
Like totally insane, totally ignorant of how of economics, of how the economy actually functions, totally ignorant about how businesses function. And these are guys that policymakers are trusting.
Right.
Trusting the advice of. I mean, it's shocking. And but they said right in there that they're going to have this on-off policy until a vaccine can be developed. They said right in there that was the end game. Wow. Mass vaccination has always been the end game from the very start, and this was always right in the lockdown advocates' own documents. So there's nothing conspiratorial about that at all whatsoever. It's been right out in the open right from the start that's the plan.
Right.
But then you have these policies until everyone is vaccinated. And of course, that implies that mandates are coming. Right. And right now, it's not really on the table because, there's just a limited supply and there's, and there's sufficient demand and limited supply. So it's not necessary, but you just wait until they ramp up production, until supply is no longer an issue. You're going to start seeing the mandates happening.
Right. I think with
healthcare workers and other things, it's already starting to creep in.
Right. No, definitely. I think it was Biden recently said by July they were going to have it all like enough for the entire US population. So, but I got my calendar on watch. I'm like, all right, it's creeping slowly closer and closer. But, and it's interesting because, when they talk about having that info right in the initial document, I mean, it goes into the idea of like, what is it that the media is actually reporting? Like, what are they actually telling us? And then we can get into the censorship issue too, where we have people like Bobby Kennedy, who is all of his information just banned on Instagram last week. All of his information is sourced from the CDC, from government websites, from all of these, like, it's all factual information, and they're just taking it down because it questions the narrative. It questions sort of the direction that we're going, or pointing out, the areas that we're talking about here, pointing out the flaws in their arguments. And so with the censorship and all of these things coming together, it feels like we're very much almost living in, I don't want to say like a totalitarian type of state, but it very much is in the lines of that, because I look at like the Nuremberg codes, for example, right? You could definitely quantify this as a medical experiment, and you need consent of the individual in order to proceed with that said experiment. So a mandatory vaccination almost feels like a direct violation of human rights, of established uh, laws that were implemented after World War II. I don't know if you wanted to speak on that, but that's
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. That was very well said. You're absolutely right. I mean, you're dead on. First of all, yeah, I mean, it is almost like a dystopia. I mean,
Yeah.
it really is. It is a totalitarianism. That's not too strong a word. It is totalitarianism. Let's not beat around the bush in terms of our language. It's totalitarianism. These are authoritarian policies that they're getting people to consent to through mass fear.
Right.
And the censorship plays a role in that. So information is being censored that's truthful. And I'll give you a very clear example. Facebook just updated its policy, I think within the last week, so
Yeah.
Not too long ago. And its new policy says that, here's one example. They say in there that if you claim that the vaccines have not been approved, your post will be removed, and you risk your account being deleted if you say that the COVID-19 vaccines have not been approved. They haven't been approved.
Right.
That's to say that they are FDA approved is a false statement. It is a false claim. They are not FDA approved. They're not licensed vaccines. They do not have FDA approval. They have emergency use authorization. This is something completely different. Emergency use authorization is for experimental products for which clinical trials are still ongoing. Pre-licensure clinical trials are still ongoing. They're experimental products by definition, and yet the public is being told that they've been proven safe and effective. Even before the pre-licensure trials are even completed, they're
Right.
proven to be safe and effective without any data on long-term effects.
Right.
And so this is remarkable. You described it exactly correctly. It is a mass experiment on the human population without informed consent, which is a direct assault on fundamental human rights.
Right.
There's no question about that. You nailed it right on the head. Yeah.
Is there a way that you would say to, like, as somebody who is obviously not wanting the COVID vaccine, down the line when we get into these like mandatory vaccinations, I mean, they're talking about like, the vaccine passports and all of that. So they're talking about different, like, you may be barred from sporting events in the stores and all of the different areas of life. I mean, do you think it's a possibility that we'll create a society that is almost sort of like it, where you have first class vaccinated people, and then below you got the second class non-vaccinated dangers to public health, as sort of a way to bypass like a mandatory vaccination? And they'll come out and they'll say, oh, we're not requiring it.
Right.
So I mean, it almost essentially escapes the technical laws, if you will, if you think of it from that perspective.
Yeah, that's precisely their approach. And they're discussing. I mean, you can go into the medical literature and read
Right.
papers on this.
Right.
Describing exactly what you just said. Of how, we can't legally, like kick down people's doors and jab a needle into their arm So we have to find other ways to get them to do it. And so these are some of the approaches that they've already decided that they're going to take.
Right.
And so, but of course, just because they're not kicking down our doors and jabbing needles into our arm doesn't mean they're not violating our right to informed consent. Because informed consent, by definition, requires absence of coercion.
Mm.
If there's coercion, it's not informed consent, period. If there's coercion, it's violation of human rights. And that's what's happening, and that's what's going to happen, and this is why it's so imperative for this information to get out, for us to bypass the censors and get the truth out. I mean, let's be fair, there is misinformation on both sides. Right. But if we're going to censor someone on Facebook for saying that these are not FDA approved vaccines, and then allow, like, for example, the government in Michigan here telling people that these are approved vaccines and that they've been approved using the same standards that every other licensed vaccine, went through. Mm-hmm. The Michigan State the Department of Health and Human Services is telling that to people. That is a flat out lie.
Right.
So, let's be objective, in terms of how we, assess information. And, if we're going to censor this misinformation, well, you have to censor the government officials who are lying to the public. You have to censor the mainstream media who are perpetuating these lies and broadcasting them to the entire population. I mean, the hypocrisy is so incredible.
Right.
That it really is a challenge, because we're being silenced. Any dissenting voices are being silenced, and we're not allowed to even be heard. And there's not allowed to be a discussion, any kind of intelligent, rational discussion in the mainstream discourse. It doesn't exist. And so, it really is imperative for us to get this information out, like through medium such as your show, and everyone can be doing whatever they can to get this information out there, because, we really need an awakening to happen, because we need to affect the paradigm shift required, where people realize that, going around spraying, disinfectants on everything and spraying our homes with disinfection is not conducive to good health.
Right.
And that, that we don't all require vaccines for good health. And, maybe the vaccine is the right choice for some people. Maybe certain people at high risk might want to get the vaccine. Maybe that's the right choice for them, but it has to be an individual choice that is based on true knowledge, and that the choice is being made with full knowledge of the risks involved, not only the potential benefits, and also the limitations of the benefits, because they're just being told it's safe and it's effective. Well, what does effective even mean? Because the trial data that was used to obtain emergency use authorization, here was the clinical endpoint, was that the vaccine was found to reduce the risk of developing symptoms and testing positive with PCR testing.
Wow.
That was the clinical endpoint that they're judging effectiveness on. So we have no data as of yet showing that these vaccines are actually effective to reduce severe disease, and it does not follow from the premise that they appear to reduce risk of mild symptoms, that therefore they will reduce the risk of severe disease. And it's because a good example of that is the flu vaccine. Just because it might have that effect, that effectiveness doesn't necessarily in elderly population, because there's differences in population. Right. And so, that was kind of an overall assessment. The 90% effective that we all heard, that was kind of an overall looking at the entire study population. It wasn't age stratified. So just because that's true for general population, maybe it's not true for people at highest risk, the elderly people over 70 with comorbidities. It might not be true for them. It might not protect them from severe disease. We don't know that, because they didn't do that. That wasn't the clinical endpoint that they were studying. We don't know whether they reduced the risk of hospitalization. We don't know whether they reduce the risk of death from COVID-19. And we certainly don't know whether they reduce the risk of all-cause mortality. And this is really, really important. This, again, comes to the total absence of long-term data on long-term health outcomes, comparing health outcomes between vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals, because vaccines can have non-specific effects. And these clinical trials are only designed to look at specific effects, which are the intended effects of the vaccine, and also what they describe as adverse events. Which are, like acute adverse events, where like you get the shot and then you have a fever, or you have some kind of reaction to the vaccine that kind of happens in the short term. and it's obviously temporarily associated with the vaccine, and you know, it is maybe something that they might a type of a reaction they might anticipate happening. But there's all kinds of possible outcomes and effects of vaccines that scientists may not even be able to imagine or anticipate. And so they describe these in the literature as non-specific effects. And a good example is with the diphtheria, tetanus, and whole cell pertussis vaccine, which is no longer used in developed countries, but it's still used very widely around the world, most widely used vaccine in the world still.
Wow.
And you know, there were never clinical trials to determine that vaccine's effect on mortality. And what the best science today shows, best studies that have been done to date show that that vaccine is associated with an increased rate of childhood mortality. An increased
Wow.
rate of childhood mortality, even though it appears to be protective against the target diseases. It appears to detrimentally affect children's immune systems in a way that makes them more vulnerable to other diseases, and so they're dying from other things.
Wow.
And so this is an example of, you know, why we need long-term, large, randomized, placebo-controlled trials comparing long-term health outcomes between vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals. And absent those types of trials, to say that a vaccine is safe is completely meaningless. And that's what's happening. People are being told this vaccine is safe, and that is completely meaningless because we don't have the data. We do not have the data to be able to make that conclusion.
Right. No, I definitely agree. In terms of that long-term study, like you said, of vaccinated versus unvaccinated, I guarantee you they will never do such a study because they would fear the results of it. You know, it would.
Well, and it's not just individual vaccines that have to be considered. I mean, that's just talking about in terms of an individual vaccine, but then you have the whole schedule.
Right.
You know, it's, you know, looking at the childhood schedule, and then they want to add the COVID-19 vaccine on top of what people are already getting, especially younger people these days. You know, children who have been born into the age of the CDC's schedule, where by the age of 18, by the time they become adults, they've had you know, upwards of 72 doses of vaccines.
Right.
And the CDC's schedule has never been studied for safety. I mean, there's
Right.
never been a study comparing health outcomes between children who were fully vaccinated according to the CDC schedule and children who've never received a single vaccine.
Right.
And interestingly, a study just came out in November. Dr. James Lyons Weiler and Dr. Paul Thomas, who's a pediatrician in Portland, Oregon, they looked at his data from his practice in Oregon, and they did a comparison. And because Dr. Thomas is well known in Oregon, in the Portland area, as the doctor parents can go to because he respects their right to informed consent. And so, you know, for example, if they need if they don't want to get vaccines, and which are required for school, they can get an exemption by signing a declination form. And lots of doctors won't do that for parents. They'll say, if you don't vaccinate according to the CDC schedule, you can't come. You can't. Your child can't be in my practice. Get out. Right. And so they go to Dr. Paul, as he's affectionately known, Dr. Paul. And so he's well known, you know, for practicing informed consent in his clinic. And so they looked at his data, and they compared outcomes between children in his practice who were completely unvaccinated with children who were variably vaccinated, because, you know, parents choose all kinds of different schedules, you know, because he does individualized, personalized medicine, and he allows parents to make their own choices. And so they end up kind of choosing their own schedule based on what they feel is best for their child, as opposed to, you know, complying to whatever one size fits all, you know, schedule. And the outcomes are astonishing, because the unvaccinated children in his practice had far lower odds of being diagnosed with all kinds of health problems, from ADHD. In fact, there were no patients with ADHD in his clinic, at least no unvaccinated patients. And then, you know, like allergies, asthma, autoimmune diseases, neurodevelopmental problems, all these types of other problems where, you know, we're seeing these increases, this epidemic of chronic illnesses. So his unvaccinated children just appear to be extremely healthy, especially compared to the general population. And even these vaccinated patients, compared to the general population, and comparing to like CDC's national estimates of prevalence of certain illnesses, are astonishingly low.
Mm.
So,
Wow.
so whatever he's doing it appears to be working well, but he lost his license. Less than 2 weeks after that study was published, the Oregon Medical Board suspended his license
Oh, wow.
in a quote unquote emergency order.
Unbelievable. I
An
guess I'm not
emergency order
surprised.
accusing him of threatening public health by practicing informed consent, essentially.
Wow. So that, I mean, that kind of shows like where the government's stance is on this. And I'm
Right.
sure
Yep.
they would
Night and day.
love, they
It's
would,
right there.
yeah,
That shows you. Yeah, that's it. That shows you where the government stance is.
right. And I think I remember reading about how it was like 1989 where they put in the vaccine companies have no liability and they started introducing all of these new vaccines. That's where you saw the increases start in these chronic diseases like ADHD and um, let's see, autism. And the list goes on and on and on of all these diseases and how they increased exponentially in kids after that was introduced. I mean, it makes me wish I was born before 1989 because I got all of those things. I don't know what's going to happen 50 years from now. Like I need to detox my own system. But
Yeah.
I mean, the data feels like it's there. It's just now getting past the censorship, getting past the propaganda, and really the machine that has become the mainstream media and big pharma and the government. Like it's working in collaboration to keep this in line. Is it just come down to the fact that the CDC is making billions off of this? Like, what do you feel the motivation to keep this schedule going when they realistically probably know that it's not for public health reasons?
Yeah, I attribute this to institutionalized biases. Some people do take kind of a conspiratorial view of all this.
Yeah.
But I don't attribute it to like ill intent. I think generally public health authorities I think they're well intended. I think they really believe their own propaganda.
Mm.
And it's because of the way, these institutionalized biases. And it's the same with media. Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman have written, the book Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media, in which they describe and they explain how it is that in a supposed democratic societies, unlike in totalitarian societies where the media is actually owned by the state, for example, how can it be that the media serve a propaganda function? And they explain in detail how that can be, because it's all these institutionalized biases that exist. So I tend to look at it kind of in more that systems analysis approach in terms of the biases that exist. And they're invested in this, and they're really good. I mean, you just described, anyone who was born, in generations a little bit younger than mine, like my younger siblings, for example, were exposed to far more vaccines and far more mercury, as an example. So throughout the 90s, the CDC schedule was exposing children, by the FDA's own admission, was exposing children to levels of mercury, cumulative exposure to mercury in excess of the EPA's own safety guidelines.
Right.
And so the thing is like, what this shows is that this whole time that the CDC was adding additional vaccines to its schedule, no one in government, no public health officials, no one at CDC, no one at FDA ever bothered to consider the exposure to mercury, in addition to all the other exposures, that children have, not just to mercury, but there's synergistic toxicity with other neurotoxins like aluminum, which is also another ingredient in vaccines. And so just looking at just the exposure from vaccines, of the mercury in vaccines, that it was in excess of their own safety guidelines. And so this shows that nobody had ever bothered to do the calculations. And the only reason they ended up doing so in 1999 was, or maybe it was 98, was because the Congress passed an act that required the FDA to kind of do an assessment of products on the market with mercury in them, which happened to include vaccines. And so when the FDA queried the industry for information about the mercury in their products, they got back this long list of the vaccines that contain mercury, and then they finally did the calculations. kind of by accident because of an act of Congress. But nobody like actually thought, oh, well, we should consider, how much mercury are children receiving from our schedule. And these are the people we're supposed to trust
Right.
with our health and our children's health. It's an outrage. I mean, wake up, America, wake up. These are, they're, and there's all this talk about vaccine, they have this phrase, vaccine hesitancy and anti-vaxxers. And,
Right.
people, and there's this great challenge that people don't trust authorities. It's like, well, why do they think? And they consider it, they always attribute it to misinformation. Well, people just have misinformed about vaccines. No, it's precisely because they're informed about vaccines. It's precisely because they're informed. It's precisely because the parents are doing their own research and looking at what the science actually says that they're choosing not to strictly comply with the CDC schedule.
Right.
And the reason that the public health authorities have a crisis with trust is because they've proven themselves over and over to be untrustworthy. That's the problem. But they can't acknowledge that. So there's all these studies, there's all these academic studies of like investigations into this phenomenon of vaccine hesitancy, and they can't figure it out. It's like, right. Oh, it can only be because of misinformation, like Andrew Wakefield in the 1998 study, and they believe vaccines cause autism, even though it's been disproven, and all this. We could get into all of that, and right. I could just that's a whole other podcast, but yeah, so you mentioned the law, and this is another important thing. So the law in 1986, it was the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which established the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, and also indemnified the vaccine industry, so that they have very broad legal immunity against vaccine injury lawsuits for vaccines that are recommended by the CDC for routine use in children. And a similar immunity has also been granted, not through the same law, but through a different act of Congress, that the COVID-19 vaccines also have, the manufacturers also have legal immunity. This is another thing that, you read the media reports about how the vaccine is safe and effective. They don't tell you, oh, by the way, if you are injured by this vaccine, you won't be able to sue the vaccine manufacturers for damages because the government's given them legal immunity because they're so safe. That,
they need the immunity.
Require legal immunity
to
protect them against vaccine injury lawsuits. So again, it just all comes down to informed consent is not happening,
right?
And they don't want informed consent to be happening. And Dr. Thomas describes it this way. Again, going back to that study, and he says they're measuring the wrong outcome because what they want me to do is to measure my vaccination rates, and if I have a high vaccination rate, then I'm a good pediatrician. And if my vaccination rate in my clinic is too low, then I shouldn't be licensed to practice medicine. I'm too dangerous for society. He's saying that's the wrong health outcome. That's the wrong outcome. What we should be doing is not looking at vaccination rates, but health outcomes. Right. And he's so right. I mean, that nails it. They're looking at the wrong outcomes. They're not measuring the right things. And so that again comes down to these it really is like a cult. It really is like a cult religion. This belief, this faith in vaccine technology, that this is the solution. This is how we're all going to be saved from COVID-19, with no thought to, the importance of natural immunity and the opportunity costs of vaccination, and how, for example, pertussis is another good example of this. Influenza vaccine is another good example of this, of how measles is a good example of infection confers a superior immunity, right. Which is really kind of obvious and intuitive if you think about it, because when you're exposed to the whole live virus, every epitope of that virus, every antigenic component that our immune systems recognize and mount an immune response to is there if you're exposed to the wild virus or the bacterium. Whereas if they just take if it's inactivated, kind of like what they call killed the component, or like with pertussis vaccine, they don't use the whole bacterium. They have certain antigen components that they've included. With COVID-19 vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, they inject mRNA into your body, which enters your cells and then turns your cells basically into factories that produce the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is the virus that causes COVID-19. Mm-hmm. And so then your immune system mounts a response to the spike protein. That's not the same thing as your immune system mounting a response to the total whole virus, and you get a total response that is not just about antibodies either. They always equate antibodies with immunity. So like there's all this kind of fear mongering still to this. It just blows my mind. Yeah, I still read articles talking about how, oh, well, the antibodies wane, their antibodies wane over time, so they lose their immunity. And no, this is so wrong. And
Right.
This is just not true. And they know, I mean, there's so many studies on this with SARS-CoV-2 that's showing that people who are infected, yes, it's true, antibodies do tend to wane, and they can wane quite rapidly, like within a matter of months. And in fact, many people who are infected and recovered don't even develop a detectable level of antibodies, and yet they have immunity, because there's other types. Your immune system isn't just antibodies. There's innate immunity, there's cellular immunity.
Right.
And so we have like T cell immunity, and there's cellular memory, so that if these people who recover are challenged again, if they are exposed again to that virus, it doesn't mean that they're going to get sick again. It doesn't mean they don't have an immunity anymore just because they don't have antibodies, because their immune system will remember that, and they will know how to mount a response that is not limited to antibodies, and they can very rapidly create more antibodies anyways.
Right.
In addition to the cellular immunity that exists. And so, if you think about it, it's really intuitive that the vaccine is not going to confer the same type of robust and a balanced immune response. So, for example, when they put, with the non-live vaccines, like the pertussis vaccine, and they use aluminum as an adjuvant in there to stimulate a greater level of antibody production, but one of the reasons why non-live vaccines in general, like the DTP vaccine, are associated with detrimental non-specific effects like increased childhood mortality, it skews the immune system. So this is the kind of like the biological plausible mechanism to explain this non-specific effect that's been observed. The increased mortality.
Right.
They skew the immune system away from a balance, like Th1, Th2 response, where they have like a balance between there's cellular immunity, like mucosal immunity and antibody immunity, all these different branches of the immune system. There's a balanced response, whereas these aluminum adjuvanted vaccines skew the immune system to a Th2 and just an antibody response at the opportunity cost of that lost superior, more balanced immune. And so this leads to autoimmune disease. It leads to greater risk of infection. Vaccinated children can still be with pertussis, can still be carriers of pertussis and transmit and spread pertussis. Whereas if they were exposed naturally and developed natural immunity, they wouldn't become carriers. They would have a more, the would get the mucosal immunity is really important,
Right.
so that they wouldn't become carriers and spread it around and risk, exposing like their infant sibling, baby brothers or something to pertussis. So there's all kinds of opportunity costs associated with vaccination. And of course, again, public health officials don't even consider opportunity costs of vaccination. For example, they don't even consider the fact that the COVID-19 vaccines have not been shown to reduce transmission. They have not been shown to prevent people from still becoming infected. And even if they don't develop, they don't get very sick from the infection, maybe the vaccine might actually protect them from becoming sicker, but they could still spread it.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, well, there's a huge opportunity cost, because if they were infected with the virus, especially we're talking about, people who are young and at low risk, people under 50 who are healthy, who have no comorbidities, the risk of dying from COVID-19 is negligible. I mean, it's very low.
Right.
And so there's this opportunity cost of where the mass vaccination could actually end up prolonging the pandemic and worsening the outcome of the pandemic over the long run, because it's inhibiting the development of a strong natural herd immunity,
Right.
as opposed to giving us the promising that the vaccine is going to create herd immunity. It could have the exact opposite effect. They don't know,
Right.
because they don't know if it's going to prevent transmission.
Yeah.
But they're not even they're not even considering that. They're not even thinking about it, which is insane. They're just saying it's safe and effective. Get your shots.
Wow.
And it's approved. Been proved.
It's
They're
unbelievable.
lying.
It's unbelievable.
But it is, like you said, it's not conspiratorial at all to say this is an experiment. This is a mass uncontrolled experiment on the human population without informed consent, a direct violation of our fundamental human rights. That's what this is.
Right. No, and I
Plain simple.
definitely agree. And it feels like common sense when you lay out all the facts and look at it from that perspective. Because you look at the death rates of COVID-19, for example, if you're under 40, like you were saying, the chances of dying from it are abysmal. Like you have a better chance of hopping in your car and getting into an accident and dying from that way. Like I'm pretty sure that's what the statistics show. So it's
No, John Ioannidis, Stanford researcher, very world-renowned, famous scientist, has written a paper just saying, doing that comparison, saying, in kind of doing age-stratified estimates of infection fatality rates, and drawing that conclusion. And he did comparisons with, like the risk of dying in an auto accident based on number of miles driven,
right.
And that is true. And he did a follow-up, review again of estimating infection fatality rate that was published in the World Health Organization's bulletin, estimating infection fatality rate to be the overall infection fatality rate to be 0.025%, which is very close to the CDC's overall 0.026%. What did I say? 0.26% infection fatality. But that's not age stratified. If you look at the CDC's age stratified infection fatality rates, which more recently it put out, for people 70 and older, especially with comorbidity, it is a risky infection. I mean, it is quite high. I think it was 5.4%, which is alarmingly high. But for anyone under 50, I mean, for children, it was 0.003%. And then for, I think it was anyone under 50, it's like 0.05%, if I'm recalling the numbers correctly. It's really quite low. It's lower than what we're told the infection fatality rate is for influenza. Like Anthony Fauci says, back in March, he's like, this is 10 times deadlier than flu, which has an infection fatality rate of 0.1%. That's what he said. No, that's not, I'm not saying that that's the infection fatality rate of the flu, but that's what Fauci said.
Right.
So it is true that and by the way, Facebook is also saying that it will censor you, it will remove your posts if you say that COVID-19 is less deadly than the flu. But in fact, for most of the US population, that's true. For most of the US population, according to the CDC's own age stratified infection fatality rates, compared to what Fauci says is the infection fatality rate of influenza, the flu is more deadly. In fact, JAMA Pediatrics has come out and said for children that the risk of influenza is far higher from the flu than it is from COVID-19. But you can't say that on Facebook now because your post will be removed.
Right.
So yeah, and with the infection, and here's another point I want to make about the infection fatality rate. So I'm talking about these estimates, but these estimates are based on what are known as their serological studies. So they do antibody tests. They do blood tests to detect antibodies to see if you have antibodies to SARS-CoV-2, which indicates that at some point you had been infected. The problem is, I've already alluded to, many people, they lose antibodies, and so they don't have no detectable titer of antibodies, or maybe they never had a detectable titer in the first place, even though they still have immunity. And so their denominator in these calculations is inherently, they're inherently overestimating the infection fatality rate, because they should have many more people in the denominator than they really do, because they're only looking at people who actually tested positive for antibodies. But there's a whole other group of people who maybe tested negative, but certainly had immunity, certainly had been infected. And they have really no way of calculating that proportion of the population. And so even these infection fatality rates are inherently overestimated for that reason.
Right. That's unbelievable. It makes you look at all of the data and just kind of scoff at the measures that are being taken, the censorship around it, because it's just so, once you wake up to it, it's just so obvious as to, maybe we don't know the motivations behind it. Like you could speculate on that all day, but just the simple facts when they're in front of you, it's like, all right, let's start talking rationally. Like, let's make some smart decisions. Like, let's actually, if we look at the lockdowns, there's more, it's potentially more deadly than the actual virus. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the need to get kids back in school. And there's just so many
Let's
different.
not pretend there's not a debate to be had, right?
Right. Exactly. Like this isn't it's just common sense. I mean, but that, so many people don't see it. And, with the fact checkers and with the misinformation, it's difficult for people to, I suppose, recognize when something is or is not misinformation. I mean, do you have thoughts on how people can sort of dive
Mm,
in, like see
yeah.
whether it be government propaganda or whether it be actual like information, like if you or I post something, how people can sort of decipher for themselves whether something is true or not?
Yeah, I sympathize with that struggle for, the average person because, I mean, I'm somebody, this is kind of what I do. I research, I read all the time. I am constantly doing research projects.
Right.
Most people just don't have time to be able to do research projects on every single, event in the media or every single topic in the media.
Yeah.
And so it is a real struggle because there is so much misinformation from both sides. I could talk about misinformation from the anti-lockdown and the vaccine, the health freedom movement. There is misinformation coming from the health freedom movement, which I also try to combat. I'm kind of stuck in the middle sometimes,
Right.
trying to combat both sides. So it is a challenge. I mean, I see that, and I see with my readers. Some of my readers are, understandably so confused about so many issues, precisely because they're being misinformed, from whatever sources. And so this is the thing. And people often ask me, like, well, what sources can I go to for reliable information? And I say none of them.
Mm.
Including me. Don't take my word for stuff. This is why I give you my sources. This is why I provide, I put references in my articles, so you can go and look up the studies for yourself. Go read at least the abstract and judge for yourself whether I'm accurately characterizing the science, and judge for yourself. Read the New York Times saying that that Cochrane collaborations studies review of the flu shot said that it confers a great public health benefit, when in fact that I could show how that review actually showed that that they criticized the CDC's policy to such an extent that they accused the CDC of deliberately misrepresenting the science to support their unsupported policy, that the fundamental assumptions underlying that policy are unsupported by scientific evidence. So this is the type of deception that's happening with the media. And so this is essentially what I do with my work, is I say, this is what you're being told. And this is the formula for most of my articles. This is what you're being told. Here's the argument, the supporting arguments to supporting that conclusion. And here are the sources for them. And here's what the sources actually say. And here's what other sources, relevant to that conclusion also have to say. And so we can draw a completely different conclusion. And so, it's a struggle. And so I guess what I have to say in terms of a solution to that is we all really have to be our own sleuths and investigators, and really just be, number one, be willing to understand our own confirmation biases,
Right.
and be willing to challenge our own beliefs, and to look at and to get your information. Don't get your information from this source, from a handful of sources, but like get your information from as wide a variety of sources as possible. Listen to as wide a variety of perspectives as possible. And then, and you really have to just kind of develop skills in terms of being able to, there's all these disparate points of information, and you just kind of have to synthesize them in a way that actually makes sense, so you can reconcile the contradictions. And this is a skill that has to be learned, and not, it's, I feel that it's not, unfortunately, most journalists don't have this skill.
Right.
And most journalists in the mainstream media are not doing journalism. They're doing public policy advocacy, masquerading as journalism. Just like there's public policy advocacy masquerading as science. But this is a skill I think every news consumer needs to have. And so this is something I also try to do with my articles. It's not just like give people information, but to kind of like train people how to think about it. Like I want people to kind of get into my own mind and see my own thought process as I'm investigating these things, as I'm researching things, and as I'm questioning things and drawing conclusions about things. I want them to see how I'm arriving at the conclusions I do, and not just telling them my conclusions and just giving them information.
Right.
Because my thought is that this helps news consumers develop their own skills to be able to, read information and not be deceived by the propaganda, because that really is a skill that we all need to develop.
Right.
Unfortunately, that's the way it is. And so that we can't just rely on this or that source to tell us what the truth is. Like, we all have to have those types of skills in this day and age to be able to do those types of evaluations and judge for ourselves. And unfortunately, that can't happen as long as information is being actively censored.
Right. No, definitely. And from looking at the totality of all the information, I can definitely attest to what you're saying. You sort of recognize, be like, okay, this makes sense from over here, and this makes sense from over here. And you kind of just have to trust yourself to be able to decipher and look at the world around you and trust your experience and just say, all right, this is what
Right.
feels like what's going on. I can see a clear contradiction from what the government's saying versus my own experience or this scientific journal, or or maybe even some of the conspiracies. I can see a clear contradiction from what the science is saying. So it's
well, a lot of times there's underlying truths to certain conspiracy theories,
right.
That it's like tossing out the baby with the bathwater, where it's like, oh, well, that's a conspiracy theory, but there was an element of that was true, right?
Right.
And just another tip in terms of how to go about doing this for your listeners is, when you're assessing, you have all this going to a wide variety of sources, and you might have conflicting information. But the first step is just to identify what are those areas where there's no controversy. What are the things that are recognized by all perspectives as uncontroversially true? And that's a good starting point. And then from there, you can identify the points of disagreement. And then that's where you need to kind of be able to assess sources and say, okay, well, what are the biases of this source? Is there an agenda? Number one, is there a political agenda being served here? And that's always a big red flag. Anytime there's a political agenda being served, red flag.
Right.
And so, just that's kind of the process that I do. And that's those are my kind of tips in terms of, how people can kind of go about, doing that type of assessment and deciding for themselves what's true. And it is an acquired skill, but we all need to acquire these skills today.
Definitely. I mean, if we're asking the question of, is it serving a political agenda, we might as well just toss out every single like mainstream news broadcasting channel, almost half the newspapers around the country, like gone, set them on fire.
Precisely.
So,
yep.
Awesome. So Jeremy, we're at about an hour. We've hit on a lot of great points. Where can the listeners go to, find your work, and, where you'd recommend sending them to, engage in this process?
Yeah, the best way to stay updated with my work, I'm on social media, but just go to my website, jeremyrhammond.com, where you'll find all my articles, and also sign up for my newsletter there, and you'll be able to download my free report, 5 horrifying facts about the FDA vaccine approval process, which I wrote before this whole pandemic happened and the lockdowns and everything, but it's very relevant for what's happening today. So jeremyrhammond.com, get on my newsletter. And that's the best way to stay in touch and stay updated with the work that I'm doing. And I provide a lot of good content in my newsletters that I don't publish elsewhere. It's a lot of good exclusive information that my subscribers can get.
Awesome. All right, and then I'll put that in the link in the episode description, so they can just go down. If they're feeling a little lazy, they can just click it, and it's right there for them. Awesome. So, Jeremy, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the podcast. I mean, I feel like this is really informative, and I'd love to keep the conversation going in the future as we kind of progress down. We see, come summertime, we'll see where we're at, and maybe, we'll need to have another one.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a good discussion. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. All right. So that'll wrap up the episode. See you all next time.